Welcome to the first meeting of in this semester of the joint Brown-Harvard seminar on South Asian politics. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, professor here and director of the Saxena Center. And this seminar is a collaboration of Saxena Center, Mittal Institute at Harvard, and Weatherhead Center at Harvard. And one of our Harvard partners is here. He'll be also commenting. This seminar is conceptualized as a mini book workshop. That's the mini book workshop. And instead of our standard 2 to 4, the first part of the book, which consists of the introduction in chapter number 6, will be discussed upon agreement between all of us till 3:30, and then we'll have a coffee break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back at 3:45 for chapter 8, an introduction. And we'll go till 5. Then we have a small reception, and then we'll conclude. We'll conclude officially at 5 o'clock. So that's the plan, and the book we are discussing is Shallow Democracy. It's a book manuscript so far. The writers, Pradeep Chhibber and Francesca. Someone told me it's not Jensenius, it's Hensenius, is it? What is the right pronunciation?
Ask her, she's online. If she
Francesca, are you Hensenius or Jensenius?
Jensenius.
She's not listening. Okay.
Jensenius is the Norwegian pronunciation.
Anyway, I have always called her Jensenius, and she's never objected to that. So Francesca Jensenius. Their book, jointly authored, has offers both from Cambridge and Oxford. Let's see where they go finally. Shallow Democracy, and of course there's time to revise. They haven't turned in the final manuscript. So the whole purpose here is to see whether there's some, whether the commentary includes some suggestions for revision, which they might consider or may not consider, depending on the force of the commentary. So Pradeep Chhibber, one of the two authors present here, has forbidden me from a term that I have often used for him, that he's prolific, so I will not use it.
Thank you.
Instead, I will say this is his 7th book. And I will, from an older introduction, which he didn't like, I will say that by the time I finish an article, he finishes a book. We are contemporaries. We are the same cohort. So this is his 7th book. And I didn't use the term prolific. I just said that it's the 7th book. Okay. And the earlier works include Righteous Demagogues with Adnan Nasimullah. Several of these works have been published have been co-authored with his students, which is also a very interesting tradition that he's setting up. Some other people have done it in the past, famously Samuel Huntington. But this is very interesting. With Adnan Nasimullah, was moving to Oxford from King's College in July. The book is Righteous Demagogues, which was presented in the form of a paper at our joint seminar a year and a half ago. So at Harvard. Before that, a book with Harsh Shah called India Tomorrow: Conversations with Next Generation Leaders, published by Oxford, Delhi. Before that, a book with Rahul Verma, Ideology and Identity. I think of all his books, that was the bestseller, as far as I can tell. But we don't discriminate between our children. Our books become our children, so we don't say which one did better and which one did not as well in terms of the circulation. Ideology and Identity: The Changing Party System of India, who finished his PhD also from Berkeley under Pradeep and now moving to Ashoka University. That is the latest news that came only yesterday. Before that, a book which was also presented at the joint seminar, but at Harvard many years ago. The Religious Practice and Democracy in India at Weatherhead Center. Mittal Institute was not born at that time. Published by Cambridge. Then two books that emerged during his Michigan days. I replaced him. I succeeded him at Michigan. When he went to Berkeley, I went to Michigan. With Ken Coleman, The Formation of National Party Systems, Federalism and Party Competition, Britain, Canada, India, and the United States. And the first book was Democracy Without Associations, Transformation of Party Systems and Social Cleavages in India. So that's the list of books. I won't obviously go through the articles in the interest of time, but and I'll introduce the commentators when their time comes. Pradeep will speak to us for each of the sessions for 20 minutes or 25 minutes, up to him.
Yes.
But let's welcome Pradeep Chhibber.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank, and I cannot say this, Ashu and the Saxena Center and the folks at Harvard for this generosity. I think it's rare that I get the chance to actually have people comment on a book that's done and give me feedback on making it better. So both Francesca and I are extremely grateful, and we will take all your comments seriously because we want to do the best job we possibly can. Right? And that's the first. I also want to thank the four discussants, Gautam, Danny, Adam, and Gabby, because for taking time out and actually spending time with this manuscript and giving us comments. So I mean this seriously. Thank you. And for me, this is, as Ashu said, the book is under contract. So I was talking to somebody earlier, just to put him on the spot. He says, so why are you doing this? I said, I'm doing this because we want to, we're at a different stage in our career. So I need to think about what are the obvious holes, what are the things that I'm missing. And the plan is to try and do the best job we possibly can, given the limitations of the data we have and what we can or cannot say. We'll never please anybody or everybody, hopefully please somebody, but not everybody, right? But that's what we are trying to do. So I really want to thank the discussant. I want to thank the hospitality of especially Ashu. So really, Ashu, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And Francesca also, I hopefully will thank you as much, right? So thanks. Okay. Now, because of a minor, so the plan is that asking people to read a whole manuscript is difficult. So there are two chapters, many chapters need help, I need help in many ways, but just the beginning. But two chapters in particular, Francesca and I thought needed help, and I'll talk about chapter 6 briefly today in more detail, and then and chapter 8, right? And both of these are very, very specific chapters. But before we get there, what is chapter 6 and what is chapter 8 is going to be meaningless to many of you. So why don't I begin with a brief introduction to the book? I'll lay out the argument, and I'll tell you how we get to chapter 6. Then I'll talk about chapter 6, and then I'll stop. Right? And I'll listen to the discussion for chapter 6. Is that the sound reasonable? Right? So I'll just lay out the argument and see what people think of the argument, plus what people think of this chapter. And it'll be great to get whatever feedback you guys can give. Okay, so how do I make this work? Is the next slide up? Okay. I can do this. Okay. So there's there are some things. This is just a standard introduction. We know that India has had 70 years of free and fair elections, right? We also know, right, that we know. We also know two other things about Indian elections, which is, one, they're very competitive. It is blood sport, if you will, right, in the best or the worst possible way, number one. Number two, we also know that the elections are unpredictable. In fact, the saying goes that no party knows why it wins or loses, right? Then in the last few elections, 2014 was a surprise, 2019 was a surprise, and 2024 was a surprise for everybody, right? And so was Maharashtra, and so was Haryana. So, elections are always a surprise. So, in other words, India is having elections, but even after 70 some years, the elections remain remarkably unpredictable, right? And that's, some of it is, I think, academics' weaknesses, but let's not go there. Okay. Now, on that, we know. The other thing which is surprising to me, and I'm just setting up an academic puzzle, which is how we set books up in academia. If you read stuff on Indian politics, what is it about? India is all about caste and religion. Once you know a person's caste, you know a person's religion, you know how they're going to vote. If it doesn't, it's not very complicated in some senses. But across the world, we also know that if people were voting their caste and people were voting their religion, to the best of my knowledge, I may be mistaken since, I've come from California where things change rapidly, right? I don't think people's castes are changing every 5 years. They may be, but maybe not, right? But I don't think they are, right? So the question is, caste divisions are stable, religious divisions are stable, social divisions are stable, and that's the academic trope, right? Understand Indian elections, tell me the person's caste, and I can explain it to you. And the argument is, we can't have both those things at the same time. We can't have elections that are unpredictable and even worse than unpredictable. I won't show you the data, and in case people want, I can share the data with you and show it to you. I'll just say this, Indian elections are also remarkably volatile, which means voters are swinging from one party to the other, election after election. And they are swinging at the village level. In a village of roughly 2,000 people, votes swing from election to election. Now, if that's going on, I have a hard time putting these two things together. Now, I don't think the social cleavage arguments are wrong, by the way. I think there is some logic there. There's some evidence there. There's good research behind it. So I think there is something there, but I think there's something else going on. And the question is, what is it that's going on? My argument is, and our argument in this book is, that Indian elections are uncertain as a matter of fact and characterized by a fair degree of volatility. And I think that is true, because if you look at national level data, and I'm not going to share the data with you, if you look at national level data, India ranks in, let's say, volatility which is vote swings between parties. The most countries we know that are the most volatile are in Latin America. They're range in the 40%. 40 is the volatility score. India, the national level average is about 26, and at the local level average is 37. In other words, elections are extremely volatile. Locally, and this is the key, voters don't vote for the same party repeatedly. There is enough vote swing from one party to the other locally, and this is looking at election commission polling booth data between 2009 and 2014 and 2014 and 2019. And in fact, last time when I presented this data, Ashu said, what about 2014 was an exception? That's most of our data. Why don't you show? And even if you look at 2019, and I won't show this to you since other people may have seen it, but if you put a graph up and you look at the BJP's vote share by polling station, there's a lot of variance. Some places they're losing votes, some places they're winning votes, even at the polling booth, even at the village level. So in other words, this idea that there is stability is something that we need to really, really think about, or votes swing significantly. The other thing and I'm sorry, I'm a parties person, so most of you, I use this word and everybody gets angry, but sorry. The standard assumption in political science is that if you have a competitive party system, people should ideally be voting for one of the main parties and not wasting their votes by voting for candidates who have no chance of winning. But we also find that in India, people are voting for parties that have no chance of winning. Lots of people are voting for candidates that have no chance of winning. So in other words, what's going on here, right? Is there something that's going on? And why is this happening? So our argument is pretty simple. And I'll go through I hope Francesca doesn't get mad because, she and I have sometimes different takes on these things, but, she's too far away to make faces in public, right? But the idea is very simple, that Indian parties are characterized by what we call a reciprocity trap. And I'll explain this in some detail. Parties are tied to local elites. That parties in India, and for reasons I'll discuss in a moment, they're tied to local elites. Because parties are tied to local elites, electoral politics and party politics is a game between local elites and party elites. And thereby, poor citizens are largely not incorporated into the political networks that characterize political parties, that sustains democratic political parties in India. And it is these poor voters, we argue, who are swinging between parties from election to election. Right? And they are the ones who are voting for parties that are less likely to win. Okay, so in other words, if you want to account for the volatility, account is too strong a word. If you partly want to account for partly want to explain the volatility, that's one thing. There's another reason why volatility in India is higher, which we don't get at in this book, and perhaps we should. But that's a conversation we can have, depending on what the reviewers, the commentators here decide to say. Okay, so I'll give you a brief overview of the talk today. So I'm going to briefly discuss the data. I'm going to talk about the reciprocity trap. And then I'm going to just show you some quick figures that the poor remain outside party networks, and essentially that the poor are contacted less by parties across the board. Regardless of what your caste identity is, regardless of what your religious identity is, if you're poor, you're less likely to be contacted by parties, even at election time. Now just think about it. Indian elections are competitive. Indian elections are where you can make a lot of money, right? If you may not read, you may or may not remember this, many of you may not, but in the last 5 years, before the BRS lost the elections in Andhra, they listed the asset gains, reported asset gains of members of the Legislative Assembly. 5 Andhra MLAs, their assets increased by over 1,000% in 5 years. So I don't know what you guys are doing, investing your money in crypto and all those kinds of things. I think you should be in a different game if you want real returns. Okay. And finally, I'll provide you a brief overview of the book and stop at chapter number 6. Okay. So what is the data? So the data is essentially these two pieces. The first data set, of course, I have to say this, which is the largest data set on elections anywhere. It is actually true, which is polling booth data for 11 states from 2009 and 2014 data matched to census data. Right? And for 2019, we have data from Uttar Pradesh with approximately 120,000 polling booths. Right? That's the data set. And I'm going to offend some people, so I'm going to may as well say this. I've seen a lot of work floating around where people are looking at GIS maps and doing this. And the more I see it and the more I know the trouble we had doing this work, I'm surprised that people actually think they can take GIS map, match it to polling booth data. And my favorite line on this is, I met a person from a leading party with this data. He was showing me all these figures and tables and GIS mapping. And I asked him, I said, what is your accuracy rate? At least he was honest with me. He said 50%. And at that point, that's a coin flip. Right? We are approximately 90-some% and we are still not satisfied because much of this mapping, and I can explain the details to you, this actually is a labor of love. Actually has to be done almost visually. There's no computerization of this possible. So this took a very, very long time. And in fact, Francesca and Sanjeev who helped us put this together along with Madhavan and Pranav and I actually have a paper under review which is just on how you put this data set together. Right? And then hopefully as soon as the paper is accepted, if it is, the data will be made public so everybody can have access to it. So it's not just for us, right? So we'll make it all available. And then, of course, we supplement this with survey data from 1996 to 2024, which is the Lokniti data. So that's the data that underlies this analysis. So what is the argument? Now, this is not a fancy argument in political science, but political scientists don't want to think about this because it's not, it doesn't sell, right? And there's a little bit of marketing, which is Indian constituency, especially just a caveat, I'm only speaking of national elections here. I'm not speaking of MLA elections or local elections. Indian constituencies are extremely large. About 2 million voters these days. That's a large, large number, right? By my count, it may be larger than some countries in Europe now. Okay, right? So there's 2 million voters in a constituency, and a member of parliament has to approach 2 million people, many of them who live very, very far away. That's the first thing. It is not easy to get to voters. In fact, in this election, we were speaking to a consultant who was running a campaign in Haryana, and he says out of the 200 villages, the candidate will manage to reach about 100. And this is complicated by the fact that not only is the size of the constituency is large, but members of parliament don't know if the party is going to nominate them till a few weeks before the election. right? So in other words, even if you know 2, 3, 4 weeks before the election, it's impossible for anybody to actually reach everybody. So what you're going to do is you're going to make shortcuts. You're going to take shortcuts. And the question of what is the shortcuts you're going to take? And one of the shortcuts you take is, so we ask this consultant, we say, what do you do? How do you decide where to go to? These are two reasons. We look at size. So the bigger the area, the more likely we are to go, the easier, more reachable it is, right? So in other words, places that are farther away and places where there are fewer people living are less likely to be reached. Makes sense, because you've got to decide where you're going to do this. And the second reason he says is when somebody calls us. In other words, there's somebody, Ashu is, the local elite of, Brown University of, let's say, Providence. Ashu says, hey, Pradeep, if you want to run the election, maybe you come by, I can get you some votes here. I show because Ashu's calling me. My deal is that maybe Ashu will support me financially as well. So we may have a kind of a quid pro quo.
I live in Boston. The local elite of Providence is calling me.
Okay, so follow me. Sorry. Okay, so somebody, right? So that's the first thing. The other thing is because of election costs a lot of money, right? And the question is, where is this money going to come from? And the money is going to come from the local elite who actually can either give money or resources, right? It's not to come from anybody else. So in other words, the size of the constituencies and the fact that you need money, right, are important constraints on how politics in India works. That's a simple observation. It's not new. But what happens in a reciprocity trap is that parties and candidates rely on the local elite networks for financial and political support. So we spoke to people this time around, and even for well-organized parties, who did you go see? Oh, I went to see first. And I'm sorry to say this, but us academics, me included, we have a very standard view of caste in India. There's upper caste, there's scheduled caste, there's OBCs. And it's not that identity politics doesn't matter in India, but on the ground, the identities that people are evoking are very, very different. And they're much more numerous than these 4 categories people use. But even there, do you think when a party approaches somebody, they say, oh, we went to let's say the Purvanchali leader, right, in Delhi. We went to the Purvanchali, we went to the most prabhavshali person, the leader. We spoke to them. The assumption is that that person will then get us the votes. Right, so what you're doing is you're approaching mostly these elites within identity networks to actually generate political support for you, and in case of economic elites, provide some resources to you. The local elite need the political class for a very simple reason. It furthers their political and economic interests. And many of them are also thinking, maybe I'll become a politician tomorrow, so maybe this is a way for me to actually move the needle a little bit. In other words, and this is going to be a little bit of a mouthful, but these networks of reciprocity between funders and parties, parties and candidates, candidates and brokers or middlemen, or vote mobilizers and brokers, and the networks of voters saturates party politics. That's it, in some senses. And the people who are left out of this are largely the poor. Okay? And I'll give you some examples of that. Of course, these elite have not been static. There was a time when these elite were mostly local landlords and local upper caste people. The idea of vote bank, right, which M.N. Srinivas came up with, that has changed quite dramatically. I think the idea of that there are vote banks in India, I think there's very little evidence for it. And of course, with the expansion of reservations, there's a new and economic reform. There are new identity and economic elites who have come about. And these identity and economic elites are actually the ones who are supporting political parties. So the landscape is much more divided now, okay, and much more fragmented. But this reciprocity trap marginalizes poor voters of all identity groups. That in a nutshell is the argument. Now I'm going to go deep into political science for a minute and then I will back out. The question, of course, people will ask is, I've got Adam sitting here, Gabby sitting here, Gautam sitting here, and, Danny, and they're all thinking of, the what ifs, the logical economic statement that's going to follow from this is, but why don't the local elite mobilize the poor, right? Elections are extremely competitive, right? Winning an election can bring, in the case of Telangana, 1,000% returns, right? Which is not a bad deal. So why shouldn't the local elite put in their money and mobilize local people, right? It makes no sense. They should be mobilizing everybody. And I think the reasons for that are, first, and this is just deep inside the weeds of political science, and I'm sorry, there's a lack of accountability. Because these local elite are not tied to the political parties in any way, and the political parties can't hold them accountable. Because political parties can't hold them accountable, or the candidates can't hold them accountable, the local elite pretty much have a little bit more leeway. If you could hold them accountable, maybe something could happen, right? But I don't think they can be held accountable, and this is true even for brokers, okay? As a result, these guys can shirk. They don't have to do what they're supposed to do, right? They can actually do a little bit less. And finally, of course, and this is really true, and Lucia Micheletti's work has shown this very nicely, most of these guys are interested in keeping the resources in-house. In other words, if you are a local elite and you're spending money, you're going to try and keep the resources within your local networks rather than pass them to everybody. So, there's a little bit of that going on as well. And there's good anthropological work from Punjab as well as UP that actually shows this. Then the issue of cash distribution, we need to address this. Everybody will say, Pradeep, what kind of nonsense are you uttering? Every month there's 1,000 rupees being given to women, then there's 2,000 rupees being given to women, right? And India is an innovator, because unlike other countries where individuals give money, now the state is giving money. Once again, we've got to thank Tamil Nadu for initiating this, right? Way ahead of everybody else. Both the DMK and the AIDMK started this, right? Picked up by Shivraj Singh Chauhan, which is, distributing money to voters. And let me just say this. I think cash distribution, leave the merits aside, really hides the inability of parties to create more inclusive politics. You're giving money, but the poor are not allowed into the networks. They're not allowed into the networks of parties. They're not allowed into the elite networks. If you need to access a school, you need to access a hospital, you have to know somebody, you have to be connected to somebody, you have to access the network. If that network isn't available to you, there's a simpler solution, right? Pass money, because expanding those networks is much more complicated for all kinds of reasons. So that's the other reason. Implication is that the poor also don't engage actively in electoral politics. Parties don't reach them, and the poor don't engage actively in party politics. Okay? What is the evidence? And I'll just show you 3 pieces of evidence, and then I will... The first one is from the 2004 national election studies. There's a myth out there. The myth is, if you go to rallies and you go to these nukkads are neighborhood meetings, which is, by the way, we studied Jaunpur this election quite carefully. We tracked it over 48 days, and most parties are organizing neighborhood meetings. Who's in those neighborhood meetings? And this is data from the 2004 NES. You realize that the poorer voters are least likely to be taking part either in rallies or in nukkads. Right? It is not the poor who are participating either in neighborhood meetings or in rallies. It is mostly the lower classes and the middle classes and the rich, and I can share more data with you if you want. That's the first thing. The other thing, of course, is, and in the first chapter, we established that the poor are excluded by parties at election time. So here's data from from surveys from 1996 to 2024, and there's ups and downs. But for all the major caste groups, the poor are always contacted less than the non-poor, right? And we constructed the poor in various ways. We use an asset measure, we use an education measure, we use a measure of education and asset, and this one is a composite measure of assets and education, but you can use Rokniti measures, you get pretty much similar patterns, right? That within each identity group, it is the poor who are less likely to be contacted by parties. In other words, you want the votes of the poor, but you're not contacting them anymore. And before some of you turn around and say, but aren't there more literates now? This is an index, and an index is constructed by saying these are people at the bottom 25%, right? So it doesn't matter. You may have more education and more money, but you are still in the bottom 25% relatively, okay? The third thing, of course, is, and I have to say this, since the Lord of the Slums and the Baroness of Panchayats is here, I have to show this data to you. And, right, which is, whom do parties contact, right? So this is from the 2015 Delhi elections. Everybody loves the Aam Aadmi Party, right? It's the party that's looking after the poor, etc., etc. So in the 2015 elections, they actually asked people, where do you live? And I should have a better table, but sorry, I was a little bit lazy. And on the left is, where do you live? Do you live in a slum or a jhuggi jhopdi? Do you live in a posh area? 3 is do you live in a DDA government type 3, 4 is do you live in a less developed colony slum-like, 5 is you live in a less developed colony well-built, 6 is you live in a rural area. Highest contract rate still remains, even in 2015, among posh areas, apartments, coteries, DDAs, high-income group. More of them are reporting contact with parties than in slums, 62%, still large, easy concentration, right? You can read lots of people. But the moment you get to DDA, you get to less developed colony, the contact rate drops. So even in Delhi, which is not that difficult to reach, this exists, right? And there's a reason this exists. And this, this is not in the chapter, but the reason this exists is quite frankly, is that most of the people who are working for parties, the vote mobilizers themselves are not poor. They are not the poor people. In fact, when you look at the data very carefully, most people who are associated with parties are lower class and middle class people. The rich don't need the parties, right? It is the lower class and the middle class people who are associated with parties. And therefore, the party mobilizes at the local level are not the poor. That's one. Number 2, and this shows up in chapter 8 very briefly, but I just thought it fits a better fit here, is that vote mobilizers, the people who are mobilizing votes, are actually less sympathetic to the poor. Even these people have a class bias. And their argument, why? You ask a simple question. Who's more responsible for the poverty? Is it the poor? And they are more likely to say, yes, the poor are responsible for the poverty than anybody else. Right? In other words, the parties rely on mobilizers, and these vote mobilizers not only are they parts of networks that are supposed to be good for their political and economic well-being, but they also have a class bias in that they actually think that the poor are, and they don't contact the poor either. So what we are finding across the board is less contact among the poor, and that's in a sense the bulk of chapter 1. As a result, what do we show? What we show is, and I'll stop at the end of this, which is there is greater volatility of vote switching between parties. And in chapter 4, we show that at the village level, electoral volatility in Indian elections is higher than in most countries, number 1. Number 2, voters are more likely to switch votes to newer parties. It's not that they're switching votes between older parties. Political scientists distinguish between external and internal volatility. And what you find is, in this case, many people are voting for newer parties. So that's the first thing. Second, we also show in chapter 5 that there's lesser level of coordination around the main parties or parties with no chance of winning, which is what we show in chapter 5, which means people are voting for parties that are less likely to win. And in chapter 6, right, we show that there's a greater likelihood of people voting none of the above, which is nota in Indian elections, where there are more poor people living in places that are far away. People are more likely to vote none of the above. And in one of my favorite episodes last year, I remember this Uber driver in Delhi telling me, sir, last election, we got paid 11,000 rupees by the parties. We took money from all of them in Bihar, in his village. Then we all went and voted nota. So I thought that was, kind of a cute story. And the important part of chapter 6, and I really want to highlight this, and I will leave this aside. For some communication mishap, I should have more details, but I'll stop here, is that the assumption here is, and we show this in chapter 6, is that parties, the reason the poor don't take part is because parties don't contact them. And we show there is good evidence that once the parties start contacting the poor, the marginal increase in the attitudes of the poor mirrors that of the upper classes. In other words, if parties are contacted, the poor start having political opinions. They start behaving politically much more similarly to the non-poor. But it is among the poor who are not contacted that you have the largest gap. So in other words, the bottom line of the first opening chapter and chapter 6 is to show that the political economy of Indian elections creates a reciprocity trap that ties parties to local elites. As a result, parties don't contact the poor, and this is consistent across survey after survey since 1996, even when elections are competitive. And this new data, which I showed just now, from Delhi, as well as the 2024 elections, even nukkads and rallies is not something that the poor actually go to. Number 1. And number two, that it's not that the poor are sitting idly and that the poor are not participating because they don't know or they don't have enough information or they don't have enough education. It's just that the poor are not being engaged by parties. And once parties engage them, their attitudes start looking similar to those of the non-poor. Okay, that in a nutshell is our argument for these chapters. I'm going to stop and now I'm getting ready for the beheading. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Pradeep. Our first commentators who will concentrate on chapter 6 or anything else they want to do, right? Because they had the whole full manuscript with them. One has been described to you as the Baroness of Panchayats. That's not my phrase. Her name is Gabby Kruks-Wisner. Has been teaching at University of Virginia since 2016. Has been an academy scholar at Harvard and assistant professor at Boston College, where she began her career, and took a PhD from MIT, from my old department. Her books include Claiming the State, Active Citizenship and Social Welfare in Rural India, which I think was presented here in an early, not at the center, there was no center at that time, at the India Initiative, up in the McKinney Room. It won the Joseph Elder Prize for the best first book in the Indian social sciences. The second book, Claim Making in Comparative Perspective, has appeared in the Cambridge Elements series that a lot of us are reading. And journal articles have appeared in Science, Economic and Political Weekly, and with Adam, a favorite article of mine, which we've used in our new project, new work, and new publications very, very much. The Geography of Citizenship Practice, How the Poor Engage the State in Rural India and Urban India, a comparison. So Adam and Gabi have this article in Perspectives in Politics. And the more recent work is on the current research. A lot of it is on, not all of it, there are several projects she talked to me about this morning, but is about policing and gender. Policing and gender with Akshay Mangala at Oxford and Sandeep Subtankar at Virginia. So let's, you have about 15 minutes, go on till 20 if you want, but not more than. Yeah? Okay. So, and the chapter that Gabi and then Gautam will discuss, primarily, though they're free to extend their gaze wider,
Can I take notes?
is called No Opinion. Chapter 6 is called No Opinion, which basically says that the poor, in each identity group that political scientists obsess about, the poor, let me say, if I'm statistically giving you a precise sentence, the proportion of nota voters, meaning a no opinion, I'm not voting for anyone, I'm casting my vote and saying I'm not voting for anyone, that proportion is much higher among the poor. That, I think, is what is being said among the poor of all identity groups. So, Gabi.
Oh, thank you so much. I've never been described as a baroness of panchayats before. I have to let that sink in a little bit. But I was so excited to read this manuscript. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for writing it. In large part because it's one of the most interesting takes on Indian elections that I've read in a long time, coming from a weird political scientist who really doesn't study elections. So I study things that happen between and beyond and underneath elections, and I study forms of political participation that largely are not about voting, not about campaigning, and largely not about political parties. And so kind of coming from that perspective, I found this a really engaging read on parties and on elections. And the other thing I really loved about it is that this is a book about class. And it's always struck me as really odd and problematic that in the study of Indian politics, we don't talk about class very much, at least in political science. I think sociology does a better job, right? But in political science, there's this really kind of odd blank spot in our study in terms of really engaging with what class means. And there's, as you write very effectively, there's a lot of kind of subsuming class politics into identity politics and assuming that they map onto each other, which we all, I think everyone in this room understands that that's way too simplistic, right? So I thought this was a really amazing contribution in terms of calling our attention squarely to the study of class and socioeconomic status in Indian politics. And so it was really refreshing to read in that regard. And I think it makes it a big book that is relevant not just to the study of Indian politics, but broadly in the field of comparative politics. It has legs far beyond the study of India in large part because of this class framing. So I found that really, really helpful and really, really useful. With all that said, I'm going to push you on the notion of class for a little while. And I'm going to offer a few comments that I took your point in the very beginning as you were introducing about kind of the limitations of the data very seriously. First of all, it's fantastic data. The work that you've done to do this mapping and to gather different surveys and to put them together is really tremendous work. It also reads really well. It's hard to write a book with quantitative data, right? And to make it accessible to broad readerships. It reads really well. It's very accessible in that sense. So I'm going to ask for things that are sort of beyond your data and that may not be possible in this iteration of the manuscript. But I do think that in a book-length project, it's possible to triangulate, bring in other sources, speculate, or at least acknowledge where there are limitations and sort of bring in some discussion that I think will kind of strengthen and situate the data that you do have. And so I guess the first point is sort of on kind of operationalizing who counts as poor. And in the manuscript, there's a lot of sort of almost dichotomous binary treatment of the poor and the non-poor, which I found a little troubling. And I understand the empirical strategy. It's clean, it's accessible. So from an empirical perspective, the way you approach it makes complete sense. But I think, again, in a book-length manuscript, there's space to situate how and why you made those decisions, and to discuss things related to the kind of complexity of what it means to be poor as a sort of, first of all, something that can be subjective, not only objective, something that is dynamic, not static, and something that's multidimensional. So you're mainly looking at assets and education, but if we look at something like basic literacy rates and Rights to Education Act, you may be able to sign your name and therefore count as literate in census data, and still live in absolutely abject poverty, right? So I think there needs to be a little more kind of complexity in unpacking what it means to be poor. I was thinking, of course, about Anirudh Krishna's work, One Illness Away, talking about kind of the dynamism of sort of flows into and out of poverty, the multidimensionality of poverty, things like that. So I think kind of situating how you talk about socioeconomic status and how you talk about poverty as a more complex, fluid, dynamic, and in some ways subjective category could be very helpful. I wondered also sort of in some of your empirical work, what happens if you treat being poor as a continuous and not a binary variable? How do some of these patterns start to look different? I'd love to see that unpacked a little bit. My other major set of comments, though, are about kind of the agency of the poor. And I love what you ended with. And in fact, it's how you end chapter 6, but I want you to start chapter 6 with it. Because you end chapter 6 saying what we should take away from this is that there's nothing latent or given about living in poverty that makes one have fewer opinions or engage more or care about politics less. In fact, there's something here about how the poor are being actively mobilized or demobilized by the structure of politics and by the structure of parties. That framing gives the poor, and again, I feel weird saying the poor because I don't think it's a static category or a binary group, but to use it as a shorthand, a lot more agency, right? And you end chapter 6 that way, and you ended your comments that way. I think you need to start there rather than end there, because I think that's a really, really important framing point. Because as I was reading chapter 6, the impression sort of comes off the page that, and even the title of chapter 6, No Opinion, that indeed the poor have weaker opinions, have no opinions, are indifferent, and participate less largely because they are indifferent, care less, or know less, or have less political knowledge. And your data certainly show these patterns, but what they don't do is they don't show how we should interpret them. And so I think this is a place where qualitative work, ethnographic work, maybe your own, or maybe triangulating with other sources, other people who've studied this, could sort of enrich this project by helping us do more to think through how we should interpret what you see empirically. So just to give a few examples, when people answer don't know to a series of NES questions about different sort of political opinions or different things, some things are procedural, like, can you name your MLA, right? Okay, fine. You've convinced me on that, right? Don't know. I don't know who my MLA is. But other things are really quite subjective, right? So, for example, the frequency with which one discusses politics. I don't actually know how to interpret that question. If someone asks me, do I discuss politics? I'm a political scientist. I discuss it all the time, right? But what counts as that? If I'm talking about my daughter's local school and whether there should be free lunch, am I discussing politics? Like what actually counts as discussing politics? That's an interpretive question, right? The survey respondent is going to interpret what that means quite differently. And so I think we need to have, I'm just using this as an example, but I think we need to situate more how respondents might be thinking about these questions. What does it mean to care about politics? What does it mean to discuss politics? How do people even understand the word politics? What counts as politics, right? So I think if we could envelop some of the data that you have in some more kind of ethnographic, interpretive work that would help us understand how people really themselves understand these questions, that would be incredibly helpful. Similarly, on this idea of having no opinion, like the title of the chapter, or weak opinions, to be indifferent, which is a word that you use a lot in the chapter. Is this indifference? Or is this simply speaking a truth that political parties have failed you? And here I want to maybe pivot, because like many of us in the room, I'm thinking a lot about our own 2024 election, and I'm thinking about our own shallow democracy. And I'm thinking about one of my favorite books of all time in political science, Power and Powerlessness by John Gaventa. Written in 1980. And as I was reading this, I was like, this is John Gaventa, right? Power and Powerlessness. And the premise of that book, it's Quiescence and Rebellion in an Appalachian Valley is the subtitle of the book. And the puzzle in it is why in this land of mineral plenty do people, why basically the non-academic, why are people not pissed off, right? Why don't we see rebellion? Why don't we see people kind of engaging more? Why do we see this, quote, quiescence? Brilliant book. One of my favorite books of all time.
I second.
Yes, but he wrote an even better thing in 2019, a 2019 article called An Appalachian Valley Revisited. He goes back after decades and he says, I got it wrong. I saw quiescence in silence, and I saw quiescence in a lack of participation. But if I read Gramsci, and if I read James Scott, and if I revisit my own data and my own interviews, in those silences, in this indifference, in this lack of opinion, in this NOTA, the none of the above, in this lack of participation, I actually see resistance, I see rebellion, or I see completely alternative articulations of what politics is and how people participate.
That's correct.
So I don't know if that's what's happening here, but I think it's a useful thing to kind of bounce off of and maybe situate some of this. I'm also thinking about, in the Indian context, Ajahn Appadharai's work, his work, for example, on the capacity to aspire, where he writes about sort of those who live in poverty having a more brittle horizon of aspiration, sort of, which I think is a beautiful turn of phrase, but I've always kind of taken issue with it because, again, how do we understand what it means to aspire? I think there's a lot of really rich work to dig into here around kind of aspiration, expectation, and how people are actually interpreting these things. So to make a long story short, I don't know how much time I have left, Ashu, but to make a long story short, I think there's an incredible richness in chapter 6 that could be much richer if you could pull from your data or from other work or from ethnographic work to sort of dig into the actual kind of agency of those living in poverty. And I think that there's almost something with the language that's being used that sort of, I think unintentionally is stripping some of that agency away. which is why I think if you started with what you ended with, it would be a really powerful framing. Maybe, do I have time for one more? Just one more. Okay.
Please.
So the title of the book, Shallow Democracy. It's a great title. I love it.
Thank Francesca for her cursor. Just kidding.
No, it's a great title, and I agree. It's an apt title, but it is a book about a crisis of electoral representation,
Yes.
right? And we all know that democracy and participation is about more than parties and about more than elections. And so, if this is a crisis of representation, and I'm sold, like it's clearly there is neglect of the poor by political parties and an undermobilization of the poor by political parties. I agree, this is indeed a crisis of representation. I think this is shallow representation. I'm not sure that is enough to say that it's shallow democracy. Because when I think about a crisis of representation, what that provokes for me is a question about, okay, so this means that representative democracy is failing.
Yes.
What else do people do? What about forms of direct democracy? So thinking about the Gram Sabha, for example, I'm not going to over-romanticize this. I mean, lots of problems here, right? But thinking about kind of direct forms of engagement, direct forms of democratic engagement, but also what some of my own work looks at is direct claim making where citizens engage bureaucracy, right? And maybe you gave the example, like, I need to go to the hospital. Well, how do I get there? How do I navigate these bureaucratic systems? Often I will contact a politician. It is mediated by parties.
Yes.
But often it's not.
Yes.
And in some of my more recent work, we try to kind of theorize, what does it mean when citizens are directly engaging bureaucratic arenas of the state? And if representative democracy is failing, maybe that provokes me to go out and directly engage bureaucrats, personnel, programs, engage in grievance redressal. There are, I think, many other fora where the poor in particular, if they are neglected by parties, may not turn away from politics, but may turn into different kinds of politics. Okay. Right? So I think...
Can you add one more minute on your Johnson Way? Emerging project on Johnson Way, where you notice participation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I was probably referring to a paper that looks at Johnson Y in the state of Madhya Pradesh, where there was a government order basically.
So how should we translate it in English? Johnson
Public hearing, right? And the history, comes, I guess, largely from MKSS in Rajasthan and the sort of civil society-led notion of public hearing in Johnson Y, which has been adopted by state governments, including Madhya Pradesh. And now there's this kind of institutionalized government-led form of public hearing. It's an interesting example, right? Because that's a space where citizens can come, sit down in a waiting room, be called in, sit down in front of a bureaucrat and speak directly to a bureaucrat. Are parties absent? No. Can everybody show up? No. Is it still party mediated? Yes. But it is a form of political participation that doesn't necessarily rest on voting or on campaigning, and doesn't necessarily require some kind of political connection. There are many citizens, particularly those who, because they don't have political connections, because they're not mobilized by parties, because they're neglected by parties, have to engage directly with the bureaucracy, right? And so I think what you're documenting is incredibly powerful, but I think instead of pushing people out of politics, it's probably just pushing them into other kinds of forms for politics. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we heard from Gabby
Thank
that silence, if you use Jim Scott, silence can be a weapon of the weak. That's the point here, right? Yes, he heavily relied on Gramsci, but took Gramsci much forward, shall we say. Took him forward. Weapons of the Weak is one of my favorite books. You have a John Gaventa book as your favorite. Weapons of the Weak is one of my top favorites. It's an unbelievable scholarly masterpiece. Dealing with a very important problem. How do the poor deal with the privileged and the landed elite, etc., in the village of Sadaka in Malaysia, and how generalizable the point might be. Our next commentator on Chapter 6 on No Opinion is Gautam Nair, one of our partners at Harvard. for this joint seminar. Gautam took his PhD from Yale. I don't think Jim was on your committee, Scott. No, that was not the committee. He's been teaching at Harvard Kennedy School for 4 years now, and his published work is in comparative political studies, international organization. That was presented at this seminar, but when it was at MIT also. A paper with Nick Sambanis on Kashmir, a paper on voter demand, clientelism, and cronyism that is much more relevant for the discussion today. It's appearing in comparative political studies soon, and there's also a paper on economic origins of democratic breakdown, which may be relevant here. I don't know. The redistributive model in post-colonial state, with Dan Slater, who was here yesterday, and Ben Smith in POP, in Perspectives of Politics. I'm speaking very political sciencey language. The political scientists all here will understand what I'm saying, POP and Dan Slater, etc. But Gautam, next 10, 15 minutes are yours on no opinion or any other opinion.
When I hear pop, I think pop was the reason. Sorry. Sorry.
Or you have a
you raise kids here, you learn that pop was the reason. I don't. That's what I think.
Huh? Raise kid?
That's me.
The connection that you were making,
Right.
which has makes multiple connotations.
You're much cleverer than I.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone. I think I want to begin by thanking Ashu for the opportunity to be part of this book workshop, and Natalia and others at Brown for putting it together. I think it's really a treat to be here, not only because Pradeep and Francesca are the preeminent scholars of parties in India, but also because I found the book to be really full of theoretical and empirical insights. It really changed how I think about representation and political equality. And I think a lot of scholars are going to have the same reaction in the future. So I think a core premise that is sort of foundational to the book is that parties play a singular and indeed, I think, essential function in the operation of large polities that characterize the modern world. Obviously, India being the most extreme manifestation of scale and size among contemporary democracies. And, party government, literally the phrase party government, has long been quite prominent to many important conceptions of democracy, going back to Schachtschneider, Walter Bagehot, Edmund Burke, and many others. And in this view, parties ensure that voters can distinguish between policy alternatives, that they turn out to vote when they might have an incentive to free ride or sit at home, and then ultimately they get accountable and representative government through structured decision-making, right? So in this view, parties are important to democracy. We can't really have good representative, accountable democracy in the absence of parties, right? Yet, I think political parties in the contemporary world are some of the most unpopular organizations and institutions, right? And the idea that political parties are vital to accountability and representation is under threat. I think there's a sense shared by many citizens around the world that parties have failed them, that have failed at delivering the goods, and that the solution therefore lies either in more participatory democracy or at the other extreme, rule by unchecked and unbound executives, right? Yes, of various types, right? And so this chapter, which will be obviously the focus of my remarks, simultaneously, I think, makes the normative case that parties in India are critical for an informed citizenry. And it also, I think, at the same time, illuminates how and why parties are failing in this basic task, right? And in a nutshell, it makes three interconnected arguments, which is sort of reflected in the book structure as well. First, it argues, and I think convincingly demonstrates, that there's a yawning gulf in political knowledge between the relatively better off and the relatively worse off. that contact with parties helps to reduce this inequality. Second. And third, that weak organizational capacity by parties means that parties reach too few voters, which in turn helps to explain the persistence in this knowledge gap, right? And so, Jensenius and Chhibber show that the poor are less likely to have, or significantly more likely to have, no opinion on really central issues, like who should form the government, whether majority rule is desirable, and whether there should be, for example, class-based reservations. That is basic questions of policy, right? And one of the striking things to me is that as much as 40% of respondents express no opinion on whether it matters which party forms the government at the center, right? And by contrast, the non-poor in this setting, the figure is about 20%. Okay, so it's a really large gap. Okay, and we also see that the evidence suggests that villages and polling booths with lower literacy levels, especially those that are further away from the sub-district, the Taluk Tehsil headquarters, are more likely to waste their votes. And Gabby sort of suggested that maybe it's not exactly the right term, but these areas tend to cast a very large number of none of the above votes. In some cases, enough to account for the winning margin between the winner and the runner-up. Okay. So I think the chapter makes a few important contributions. One is, I think from a normative perspective, it actually makes a really powerful case for the importance of parties and also the insufficiency of their action. The second is, I think, as Gabby already pointed out, it really shifts the focus from ethnicity to class. And it highlights, for example, that the fraction of nota vote is better predicted by distance from or remoteness than is the share of the marginalized population. Okay, that is people belonging to SCs or ST groups, for example. Okay, I think so. That's the sort of theoretical contribution, and the data, as has already been pointed out, is really rich. So there's polling booth data from these 290,000 villages. In this particular chapter, there's about 36,000 citizen survey observation. And I thought from a methodological perspective, it was also neat that it takes these don't know responses seriously. Now, I haven't actually seen that been done in other papers in political science. And certainly I've been guilty perhaps of the crime of just discarding these responses. But to take it seriously as data, I think is something that a lot of other people should do as well. And given that it's such a frequent response, I think we should put it in all our survey questions, and that we might want to figure out what people exactly mean by this, and the variation. Finally, I think, like the questions that are used are relatively straightforward, simple questions, like who should be the party in government. And so I think that's quite understandable for a lot of people. And then, there's some methodological stuff about multi-level modeling, which makes some of the inferential questions that people might have a little less salient. Okay, so I thought the chapter was already quite compelling, and it's also compact like the book, which doesn't really waste space and get straight into the data and the findings. I thought, however, that there were a few areas that could potentially be extended, given that it's already in a relatively finished form. The first one was what party contact actually means. Is it that you just knock on somebody's door? Is it that you attend a rally? What does that actually look like? Because this variable is used very frequently in the analysis, and I wanted a sense of what that feels like. So like a panna pramukh is supposed to knock on everybody's door, tell them about welfare programs and so on. I don't actually know if that happens, and what people understand by party contact. Has somebody been to see you, for example? Can
you explain to this audience the concept of panna pramukh?
Yeah, so it's become important in the sense that people, the BJP is sort of have an organizational advantage, and one of the key components of its strategy has been to task people in every village with literally a handful of, or not a handful, maybe a couple of hundred voters on each page of the voter list. Okay,
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
has anybody seen this actually happening, or is this all talk?
Well, exactly. That's exactly my question. I don't know. It's sort of like, oh, are there really 100 million members of the BJP? I don't know, maybe. But given that people sign up for all kinds of things, certainly I do. I'm not sure. But I think like a little bit more clarity on like what contact means and what gives it this special ability to inform voters would be helpful. Okay. I also, if you just look at the data, right, it looks like parties are actually getting better at reaching more voters over time. So there's still a gap. But if it's the case, if we just plot a graph of the first table that you show, or first or second, is it the case that parties are getting better? And so are they actually closing the gap? So maybe poor voters are worse off relative to non-poor voters, right? But maybe they're only 5 years behind. And so perhaps we need not worry so much, except that it matters even within the constraints of an immediate electoral term, right? The other thought I had was, you could do perhaps more to quantify the actual value of party contact relative to other, say, modernization factors, So what is party contact equivalent to relative to an additional year of education, which is thought to be a very powerful predictor of participation and turnout around the world, right? And that would give a concrete sense that this really matters a lot, You could actually do other things, but this was, I think, tractable with the data that you have. I think would really drive the point home. The other thought that I had was, okay, so what is the role of majority rule is something that political scientists think about a lot, and certainly like people who do the NES would also worry about. But, maybe voters' concerns are more immediate. That is, that they care about, welfare programs, has their income risen, who's providing credit subsidies. Those types of things might be less amenable to the don't know questions, and parties might have a greater incentive to persuade voters on those types of questions than the broader abstract questions of democracy and so on, So maybe you could, and those questions are also asked, and you could use that as a better and more concrete measure. As I mentioned, there's lots of over time variation. So maybe parties have become more or less effective at reaching voters over time. And I would like to know more about that. India obviously is a big place. And you do point out that some parties, like the DMK in Tamil Nadu, have been historically better at mobilizing voters. So does that sort of party organization remain? So if you go to the DMK office in Chennai, it's an amazing building, in the sense that they have a beautiful library with all their manifestos and so on. And it does seem like they are quite organized. So do you see lots of state-wise variation? Or is it really just sort of consistently seen across the whole country? Okay. I think with the question that you have, you might also back out, like who parties try to reach out to, under what conditions do they try to get to the poor, because maybe electoral competition matters a lot. Maybe it's just distance. Maybe it's the cost, literally like road infrastructure. And that might also be valuable from the perspective of a policymaker, because then you would know, well, if you want to improve party contact, these are the things that you might look at, finally, well, I have three final sort of big picture thoughts about the book. One is about India relative to other countries, right? So is India better or worse at party contact? I was thinking of the Mayor and Katz, the cartel party article. And this sort of mass catch-all party, appeared in the early 20th century, and then the party sort of lost their organization. And is India like an outlier? And I think maybe there's some way of knowing that. But to understand like where we are on the spectrum would be, I think, very valuable. The second thought I had was about, representation and what it means. So on the one hand, parties are not reaching a lot of voters. Voters feel that they are disenchanted with parties because, they're not being contacted and so on. On the other hand, you point out that there's sort of convergence in party platforms. All the parties agree on some degree of welfare and redistribution, right? So that does seem like there's representation at the policy level in a very important thing, which is really quantitatively more significant, perhaps, than MP-led schemes or vote buying and the like. But how could we square this circle, right? And I had two thoughts. One was, and this would just be sort of consistent with the median voter logic, right? The median voter is still a poor voter, and so actually you are getting representation exactly as what we predicted. One thought I had was that actually welfare is still targeted at relatively better off voters, even in rural areas, for example. So there are many schemes for farmers that are tied to how much weather and how much land you have, right? That's one example of it. Or where infrastructure spending happens, right, might be a bigger determinant of life chances than is, the cash transfers, which might actually still be a small fraction of government spending. The second thought is that actually what poor voters want is not just cash transfers, that they want better schools, they want better healthcare, they want these fundamental things, and they have to sort of settle for undistinguished welfarism of a kind, basically consumption, immediate consumption, rather than public investments. And parties are just getting it wrong, and therefore they're going underrepresented. And finally, I had a question really, which is, you've thought so much about parties. So how do we actually improve the strength and functioning of parties in India? What should we actually do? Would we make the constituencies smaller? Should they be bigger? What are the trade-offs? What if we actually get more organizationally powerful parties? Will we have a more clientelistic politics? Or will we actually have better representation? So those are some thoughts I had, but I really enjoyed reading this chapter in the book and I learned so much. Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes left in this in this part one of our plan for this mini book workshop today. We'll take a break at 3:30, coffee break, and come back. And then I think since he's already summarized given the argument in the introduction, so I think Pradeep will probably speak for 15 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever, and concentrate on chapter 8, which is use of discretionary funds, which is a very important matter by parliamentarians. How is that done? And then we'll have the commentary. But in the remaining 7-8 minutes, let me use my time, abuse my power as the chair of this to take off a bit on both of the comments that have been made. So let's say Gabby said, is it shallow representation or shallow democracy? What is the best conceptualization of the material here, right? And let me come to it from two strands of democratic theory. And Gautam said, is India exceptional or is it on the trend line? So let's use two kinds of democratic theory, or two major strands in democratic theory, which claim to be general and cover the universe. Judged against that, what would this material suggest? So one is the foundational text of modern democratic theory, Polyarchy by Robert Dahl, 1971. And the way democracy, and it is basically about electoral democracy, though not only about that, but focuses electoral democracy. And there are two axes there. One is how competitive the elections are, that is X, I think, and Y. The vertical axis is how large is the participation. And there, one issue is simply legal. Do you have the right to vote? And the other is, if you have the right to vote, do you vote or do you not vote? Right? So you can construct an index of these two for the y-axis and for the x. If you see that, if you judge the arguments of the book against polyarchy, then you could say that India is very competitive on the x-axis, no problem. And on the participatory axis, everyone has the right to vote, but some people do not vote right? And therefore, you can say, if you combine the two in a Dalian sense, it is shallower than it could be. Democracy is shallower than it could be. There is a second strand of democratic theory, which talks about participation not only in elections, but in other spheres, and that is Sidney Verba and the SES theory. The SES theory, it claims to cover the West in general, but in the original book, India is present, mind you. In the original 9, India is a case significantly studied because Sidney Verba kept arguing that you cannot exclude India from a discussion of democracy in the world because it is the largest democracy of the world. And in very unlikely settings, their democracy has continued to function. So, and in that, SES theory was what? Ultimately, SES theory was socio-economic status. The higher your income, the higher your socioeconomic status, the more urban you are, the more educated you are, the more likely you would participate in democracy, both either in elections or in non-electoral aspects of both. So that the poor are, according to SES theory, the poor do not participate much in election for a whole variety of and other aspects of democratic participation for a whole variety of reasons. So if India is to answer Gautam's question, if India is a shallow democracy, then America is a shallow democracy, and all of the West is a shallow democracy. Because the poor do not participate for a whole variety of reasons, both in as much as the non-poor do. So why single out India as a shallow democracy? It is perfectly consistent. What you're describing is perfectly consistent with one of the great theories of democratic participation, Verba and Nair, Verba and one of your colleagues, Verba and Henry Brady, Verba and Nair. It is somewhat anticipated in the 1960s work of Verba with Almond also, but it's fully blown up, fully developed in the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s. So India is a regular democracy. It's not a shallow democracy. If we use the Verba criteria of democratic participation and compare India to the 8 other Western democracies included in the original work that Sidney Verba produced with Nair, right? So, Natalia, can we take a break now? So we take a coffee break and we come back. There is one more aspect of democratic theory, or one more stream, which we might want to consider as we consider India comparatively, responding to the question that Gautam has posed, and in a way, Gabi also. So the relationship between income and democracy, Adam Przeworski in Democracy and Development has the most exhaustive data on that. 140 countries covered or so since between 1950 and 1990. Huge data set. And the argument finally, statistically, is that income is the best predictor of a democracy. And in 77.5% of the cases, it predicts democracy correctly. But there is still 22.5% of the cases that remain, which are not predicted by democracy. And he puts India in that, obviously, because India became a lower middle income country, according to World Bank classification, only in 2005. Before that, it was a low-income country from 1950 to 1995 to 2005. That's the period Adam Przeworski covered and his colleagues. And he says that there's a very famous sentence in that book on page 87, I think. You can line. It's a democracy was least likely of all the exceptions. And the 22.5, right? Democracy was least likely in India. So yes, and sometimes in a humorous mood, he would say that it has a negative. There's nothing called negative probability. The lowest probability is going to be 0. So he used to say it's a negative probability. And then he said, of course, what I mean is close to zero.
But the predicted probability might be negative.
Right.
So while discussing this, we may want to consider that as well. But let's begin and with Pradeep's summary of his.
No, but I thought
If Paulomi wants to speak now, she can speak now, or she can speak after the two when we have
I think it would be good to
fuller
focus on
discussion.
Chapter 6 because chapter 8 is a little bit
Okay.
different kettle of
Okay.
fish. So anybody comments?
Would you like to? Yeah, let
And I'll
Paulomi
respond
speak. Yeah.
later, Yes. Yes, Paulomi.
So I don't.
On chapter 6 is about no vote. Okay. So let's take 3 comments.
And the
And then,
introduction, right?
yeah. And then,
Okay, so
Whatever.
I've already WhatsApped Francesca, and
Okay.
I have to leave right after your response, but it has nothing to do with my attitudes towards your response. So I'm just letting you know, right? Like I'm not like walking out.
That won't stop him anyway.
Okay, so from the way I understand your argument, it's that volatility in India is explained by the voting behavior of the poor, who swing back and forth. And they swing back and forth because they are not incorporated into political networks, and they have less contact
right.
with political parties. Okay, so I guess my main question is I'm wondering about variation among the poor.
Mhm.
So are some people more loyal than others among the poor, right? The reason I'm wondering this is because it's possible that, in your argument, the lack of party loyalty among the poor has to do with this like network analysis,
Yes.
right? But perhaps it's just a more simple answer, which is that they're not being materially served by any parties. And therefore, if we could observe variation among poor voters and see that actually, people who do get cash transfers are more loyal, then maybe the real mechanism that explains the lack of loyalty is not network-based, but rather a more material, analysis. Okay, so that was my first question, really. My second question assumes that you are right about the mechanism. My first question assumes you're wrong.
That's fine.
So the second question assumes you're right. And then to follow up on your comments, right? I was really wondering about the degree to which you think your theory travels to other contexts, right? You started with Latin America, and I'm curious, do you think that there is greater volatility there because the poor are even less incorporated into parties? Does this mean that there's? I don't know. I think the U.S. is less volatile, right?
Yeah, much less.
Yeah.
But lots, all kinds of reasons, right?
Right. So is that because the poor are more incorporated? So yeah, those are my 2 questions.
And the poor are smaller in number. However, the poorer you are, the lesser the chance you would vote and participate.
Yes.
That is the SES theory.
That helps.
Yeah. Gilles, your 3 minutes maybe? Yeah?
I'll try to be as telegraphic as I can.
Okay.
No, actually, I'm jumping on that, but I'm wondering how the argument, square with what we know about participation. Precisely, we know that it's higher among the poor, or with James Maynard's own argument that political literacy has very little to do with formal literacy as well. And what you sort of cast as, so the way you presented the don't know, no opinion, it still seems to be a little bit of a black box to me. What is the space also for for diffidence, for cynicism, for outward rejections of political figures in Delhi who they do very, very far and sort of immaterial to our lives here. Second, the shallowness of representation should not really come as a surprise given
the volatility and the shallowness of given the volatility of representation of representatives themselves, right? I mean, you know from my work how the short life expectancy of elected representatives and a very high rate of turnover, which also prevents politicians from actually building significant ties with their constituencies, over time. And there are also sort of systemic factors that are induced by the degree of competitiveness that we have that also intervene. And third, I'm struck by, you may appear to assume that electoral campaigns sort of are important to outcomes, and they may be to a certain extent in campaign effect and all that. But mobilization that takes place, party mobilization that takes place, it's constant. It's relentless and it's constant in everyday life via media exposure, via the deployment of the visual presence of politicians on the physical presence of the political image, everywhere, and that also connects voters to parties, and so I'm wondering whether focusing on formal campaign activities, which we know happen over a very short period of time, with all the constraints that you yourself mentioned, is limitative to your argument. And the point of technicality on who gets, candidates darshan, the difference in the number didn't strike me as being, very high between posh and poor area. So especially if you consider that there are far fewer posh areas and poor areas, that may also account for the slight variation that you find in the data.
Yamini, your 3 minutes.
Thanks. Just building on what all of them are saying, I think I'd be really interested in understanding how things have changed over time, if they have at all. Because set starts in 2009 and cuts all the way through fairly big shifts. The biggest shift being that there has been a sort of evolution of the terms of the political contract between politicians and voters, which I think cash transfers have played a very big role in reshaping. I mean, the way in which the state has organized itself and it has used technology as a means to elicit loyalty and as a means to determine how citizenship in the political context is being asserted has changed quite dramatically. You could argue that it was kind of limited and almost non-existent in the 2009 to say 15-16 phase. But it has shifted since then, and that cuts across all political parties. It's not just a BJP phenomenon. All regional parties are playing in the same game, and so I wonder, when we are thinking of political I think Gabby's intervention and Gautam's points were exactly right in terms of kind of also broadening how we think about political participation beyond the act of vote, beyond the election and the act of voting, but also the nature of people's engagement with politics is also shifting because technology is changing how politicians are reaching people in terms of welfare delivery of the state. So just looking at that transition over time, I think will give us a lot more insight.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you, Yamini. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Pauline. And now Pradeep will have his 10 minutes on Chapter 8, the discretionary use of discretionary resources by parliamentarians.
Okay. So,
privileging one's own is the title.
Right. So let me. Errol, I'm lost without you.
He's a life giver.
I'm always lost, but today even more so. Got it. I got it. Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, that's on it. So let me get to the what do we do in the remaining chapters, right? So first, in chapter 6, which we spoke about, we speak about this. In chapter 7, and I think this gets to questions she raised, and I'll answer people's questions a little bit later. I have some thoughts, and I actually want suggestions. So some of these will be open, and I want to see what people think. We've showed that there are lower rates of political participation, and we show, and this I think is something that most people may not be aware of, is that there is actually even lower turnout in places that are far away and have more poorer people. So in other words, at least the aggregate data, the village level data, shows that there is a slight drop in turnout in poorer and more remote areas. So the idea we have that, in India, the poor are voting at large numbers, I think is, first, even from the survey data is incorrect because the numbers are showing that similar voting patterns, not higher, right? And even the similar stuff, at least the aggregate data doesn't seem to suggest that at least places that are remote, more remote, and places with more poor people actually have lower turnout. So that's what we find in chapter 7. That's what we discuss in chapter 7. Now in chapter 8, and this is a chapter where we have, quite frankly, and I'll be upfront in this room, is where we are unsure as to what we are doing here and do we need it and what do we need it for, right? And the purpose of the chapter really is to say, if we say there is this reciprocity trap, right? And because there's this reciprocity trap, there are people who are allocating funds, right? And the question is, how do we show that this reciprocity trap is actually working in practice? Because so far we've only asserted it throughout the book. We say it in the beginning, and we say this reciprocity trap only favors people within the network. Now we need to say, does this reciprocity trap actually make a difference on the ground, right? For us to make all these claims. So we adopt two strategies. And the two strategies, the first is, and which is pretty much more robust, which is members of parliament using MP Lads funds. How do they direct their MP Lads funds? And they basically give money and they spend more in areas that vote for them in higher numbers. So those results are pretty okay. And what's interesting is they also allocate less money to areas that are farther away. In other words, politicians are choosing where to spend money, and they're mostly spending money in areas where their networks exist. So the MP Lads, that data is pretty good. Now we come to the slightly weaker part of the data, to be blunt, right? And the weaker part of the data is where we conceptualize something, and this one person who reviewed it said, you need to convince me a little more before I buy this. So I want to know what you guys think. Okay, so here's where we are. So building on the argument made by the two aforementioned royals, right, that there are different types of vote mobilizers in rural and urban areas, hypothetically, right? And just parenthetically, and just to pick on Adam and Gabby, just because I know them well and I can say this, even in their own, that paper that Ashu cited, which on, rural, there is actually footnotes. And if you look at the footnotes, it actually shows that the poor behave differently, but let's not go there.
You mean in the POP paper?
Yes. You see, nobody reads the footnotes, right? Sorry, I'm looking for evidence, right? But either way, you may recall that, or you may not recall it. I don't know. Yeah, you better look at it quickly. Okay. So in any case, so the question we are arguing, and this is a matter for discussion, right? So I just want an opinion. The argument we make, and this is not fully flushed out. So here's the argument we make. That the nature of the reciprocity trap differs between areas with and without financial institutions. So what we do is we look at the census data and we do other things. But we take the census data and we look at how many financial institutions there are in an area. And that data you can get from the census, right? So we look at cooperatives, bank, agricultural societies, mandis, in other words, places where money is being exchanged. Okay, so that's the measure we have. Now, there are places in India where there is none of this. In fact, in at least till the last census, 2011, who knows when the next census will be held, right? And if Yamini is saying never, that also means that there may be no reservation for women because there's no delimitation happening.
Who wants it except for a vote?
Except for a vote, right? So I'm just saying all this will follow. If you're thinking purely strategically, all these things that have been promised will not happen if there is no census, because no census, no delimitation, etc., etc. Who knows? I don't know what they're going to do. But let's leave that aside. So the last census, there are still villages in India without any public goods. right? So we even look at those, and we look at places where there is. So in a stereotypical rural area, right, where power is concentrated in the hands of one lord, right, one village, there are no competing institutions. You can imagine that traditional vote bank politics would play a role, right? The big landlord, the big whoever it is runs the show, and you would get traditional vote bank politics. And in traditional vote bank politics, whether there's lower or higher turnout remains determined largely by the relationship of the person who runs the vote bank to the party. And that's, I don't know, we don't have any serious predictions on that. But what happens is there are multiple power centers. And the way we operationalize multiple power centers is how many financial institutions there are. And the argument we make, and this is, I want to know what people think of this, because this is I don't know the right, I'm not a grammar expert, but this is a slightly different way of thinking of this question. So I don't know how people would react to it, which is that we think of financial institutions essentially as a metric for how many places you can have brokers who are actually maneuvering and negotiating these institutions, and these multiple financial institutions means that there are multiple power centers, and there may be multiple people rotating around those power centers, right? That in a nutshell is an argument. And if there are multiple power centers and multiple people rotating around those power centers, there's more likely to be more visible rent-seeking activity, more visible corruption, because more of these power centers are controlled by individual people. And this could lead to more, the argument goes, to more disenchanted voters, because voters are seeing what's going on, right? There are lots of people making money. So what we do is we run the same statistical specifications as previously. And what we find is that places where there are multiple financial institutions, even controlling for all the other stuff, there's actually lower turnout and more nota voting, which means more people are seeing these institutions. The more financial institutions that exist, the more corruption there is, the argument is, the more networks are important. And we also find, therefore, that there's greater fragmentation of the vote. So, and these are the two results we find, right? That's what we find. And that's the question is this, and what we really want feedback on is this even a useful way to thinking about operationalizing the reciprocity trap in some indirect way and actually getting at its implications? So that's what we want feedback on. And this is, and if you want, I can show you the pictures and tables to you, but I don't think we want to spend our time worrying about, statistical specifications. I'd rather get your input on this. And finally, we conclude, and the conclusion is pretty simple, that a reciprocity trap between parties and the identity and economic elites marginalizes poor citizens. And electoral politics in India faces a persistent crisis of representation manifested in unpredictable elections, large vote swings, the absence of stable voter-party linkages, and largely because parties are unable to offer more inclusive politics to the vote. That in a nutshell is where we are. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let the discussants tell me, and then we'll open up, then Ashu will decide what we do.
Okay, so the first commentator for Chapter 8 for discretionary use of parliamentary MP funds is Adam Auerbach, Associate Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Hopkins, Johns Hopkins. The first book he wrote was Demanding Development, Politics of Public Goods Provision in India's Urban Slums. And the second book with Tariq Tachil was Machine Politics, Migrants and Machine Politics, How India's Urban Poor Seek Representation and Responsiveness. Because he's been his work has concentrated so much on the urban poor, Pradeep chose the term Lord of Slums for him. But he's going much beyond that in his newer work.
I didn't use that word intentionally.
Yeah. The Demanding Development, it's won prizes. Machine Politics won prizes. Not machine, Migrants and Machine Politics won prizes. And Adam certainly is a leading scholar of urban India today. So let's hear him on Pradeep's argument.
Stand up here,
Please, I will move.
no slides for me, but all right. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And yeah, please let me start, by thanking Ashu and thanking Pradeep and Francesca for writing, such a fabulous book. Shallow Democracy makes a number of really fundamental contributions to our understanding of Indian politics, specifically regarding how the poor are mobilized and represented. The book argues, as we've heard, that underneath the rough and tumble of India's elections lies this surprising unevenness in voter mobilization, with consequences for whose interests are served by the state. The poor, Pradeep and Francesca argue, are systematically less mobilized by and connected to political parties than their better off counterparts. Parties are instead mostly focused on building ties with local elites who could deliver resources and their followings within their domains of influence. And then this reciprocity trap between parties and local elites renders India's democracy shallow vis-a-vis the poor and contributes to India's hard to predict electoral volatility. So huge congratulations again to Pradeep and Francesca for writing, such an outstanding book. I was assigned chapters 1 and 8. So if it's okay, my comments will sort of straddle both of those. But yeah, I really hope that they prove useful, in some of the revisions going forward. So as noted, a core thrust of the book asserts that the poor in India are less likely to be mobilized by parties than their wealthier citizen counterparts, with these downstream implications that we've learned about for stability of electoral behavior and the quality of representation. So this is a really far-reaching argument, and it overturns so much conventional wisdom on Indian politics, not just within comparative politics, but in related disciplines as well. For this reason, I think the introduction of the book and the manuscript more broadly can do so much, much more than it currently does to frame the book's main argument. It's something that, to me, dramatically and surprisingly calls into question so much of the conventional wisdom on politics in India and the other global South democracies. Right now, I think that the book almost downplays just how much it shakes up what I thought was well established. So, to speak specifically of what those literatures suggest, so my priors, based on literatures that I'll mention in a moment, is that parties in India disproportionately focus on mobilizing the poor. So several distinct strands of scholarship point to this and why it might be. So first and foremost, outside of political science, Partha Chatterjee influentially made this distinction between political society and civil society in his landmark book, The Politics of the Governed. To him, the poor in India, they have political society. And this is an arena animated by political parties, protests, political brokers, and that's what they have to advance their material interests and security. Conversely, the propertied better-offs, they have civil society. They have things like the resident welfare associations, more direct ties to the bureaucracy and the courts. The rigidity of this binary that Partha Chatterjee, has built for us, has been certainly critiqued over the last several decades. But still, I think there's a general trend to see the poor as the foundation of popular politics in India, including their use of and embeddedness in political party networks. So besides Partha Chatterjee, other scholars that you and Francesca might consider engaging more on this lines are Ananya Roy, John Harris's work, Solomon Benjamin, Ward Barenschot, Lalitha Kamath, and Stuart Corbridge. A second literature that I thought might be useful to more fully engage, especially in the introduction, is that on distributive politics. This literature, especially the comparative literature, repeatedly and explicitly argues that the poor are the central focus of party mobilization in democracies like India that are marked with non-programmatic politics. This is because the poor experience greater material needs and insecurity, making them more dependent on parties and their networks and their local foot soldiers to gain access to state resources. In its current version, the manuscript doesn't really engage with scholars that I think it would really benefit from engaging. Javier Hierro, Simeon Nichter's work on Brazil, Rebecca White-Shapiro, Mariella Swartberg, and Vicky Murillo, all of whom have argued why and how parties exert significant effort in building sustained ties with the poor. I think incorporating some of this work will both expand the audience of the book and also clarify some of its contributions. Further, there's been a few recent shifts in the literature on distributive politics, at least how I see it, that I think are particularly relevant for shallow democracy. First, a handful of recent studies demonstrates that most of the action in party voter linkage building doesn't happen during elections. So this kind of gets to Gilles' earlier point. Instead, networks between the poor and parties are forged in between the votes. especially as citizens turn to state institutions to solve problems and access resources. A process that often, although not always, involves the use of party networks to broker access to state resources. Because we know, the Indian states and other states, particularly in post-colonial contexts, can be so discretionary and dismissive, especially if you're poor or you're from a disadvantaged caste or religion. Party workers and networks can become important bridges to the state. If this is at all correct, then that these ties are mostly constructed between elections, it suggests that we also need to look for evidence of how parties build ties to the poor in between elections as well. Second and related, a large group of studies, and certainly Gabby is a leader in this work, but other scholars comparatively, scholars like James Holston, Asif Bayat, show that the poor have really considerable agency in their engagements with state institutions and political parties. So there's this constant hum or groundswell of bottom-up petitioning and what Gabby calls claim making among the poor. So these local elites, these vote mobilizers discussed in the book, I assume many of them are getting substantial pressure from citizens within their domains of influence. So what extent can this generate some degree of informal accountability within what is otherwise a reciprocity trap? Similarly, I think one of the takeaways that Tarek and I, really hope to make in our recent book is that the poor can be central protagonists in building the political networks that bridge them to the states. So, our surveys and censuses of party workers in cities in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, and increasingly in smaller towns, nagarpalikas, nagarparishads, shows that these party networks, these karyakarta, the padadikari, really can spread their tentacles wide and far. Yet they float underneath what might constitute a local elite, and that these networks don't come swooping down during elections, alone, but are instead built between them and are shaped by this constant buzz of citizen action. I'm also wondering to what extent these local elites, these vote mobilizers, need to compete with one another over a local social following within their village, within their town. An interesting study that came up in my mind in several parts of the book is by Mahavish Shami, a professor at the London School of Economics, who I think has been doing really fascinating work on rural Punjab in Pakistan. And what she shows in her work is that even the introduction of a simple paved road into a village can break some of the dependence ties between farmers and local landlords, and introduces a more competitive brokerage environment into contexts that we would least expect them. And she then shows that this has downward consequences for representation and public service provision. But I wanted to read a little bit more about sort of who these local elites are, especially the extent to which they have to compete with one another over currying favor with parties and also building ties beneath them. So just to summarize this larger point, I think the book, is really overturning broadly held conventional wisdom. And so I think it would benefit from sort of expanding the aperture of the literature engaged and more pointedly outlining why this largely held premise of party mobilization of the poor is off the mark. This point is relevant also for the empirical findings, how they're discussed and framed in the book. So for example, in the intro, responses to the question, has a party worker come to your house to ask for your vote within a month of the election? This has come up in some of the earlier comments. It's doing a lot of the work in establishing the puzzle of under-mobilization among the poor. Yet this is a purely electoral time, form of engagement that might be potentially masking other sustained forms of interaction between the poor and political parties. There's, of course, a variety of ways that parties seek to build jansampark, relations with voters during elections, neighborhood level rallies where food is provided, where candidates give speeches. So perhaps the poor are disproportionately targeted with group-based campaigning, especially in densely populated low-income neighborhoods. Also, Gautam brought this up earlier. I wanted to hear a little bit more about, having your door knocked on. How was that a sign of mobilization? What is the quality and content of that discussion? Is it possible that parties need to do less during elections to build relationships with the poor because those connections are so tightly fostered in between elections as well? I think these questions might be especially important to consider because of the differences in some of the contact rates and the crosstabs in the introduction are not super dramatic, especially among the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So might these gaps close or even reverse in some ways if we consider a wider repertoire of forms of party engagement. Okay, so just to pivot to chapter 8, this chapter is just immensely impressive in terms of the data collection that you and Francesca did. I mean, it really is heroic. And the fact that you teased us that this data might become public, at some point it's very exciting too. And the use of MP lads. So I found the analysis really compelling, really exciting chapter. So my first point of reaction to this, but this is also a more general point for studies based on MP lads and MLA lads. A huge analytical benefit of these funds, of course, is that they can be used in discretionary ways. There's sort of a direct line between the distributive preferences of politicians and how they're spent at the local level. That said, MP lads, are really, and I think Yamini can speak more to this, are really just a drop in the bucket with respect to the discretionary operating budgets of at least urban local bodies. I'll deliberately focus on ULBs because that's sort of where my familiarity with public budgets mostly rest. So revenue receipts and capital receipts for ULBs are overwhelmingly come from the State and Central Finance Commission. The amount given to local area development funds is very, very small in comparison. Yet MLAs and MPs, are often, we're finding this a lot in our studies of small town politics in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, are incredibly influential in how local budgets are spent. So I'm wondering then, is it possible that MPs and MLAs use their local area development funds as these patronage slush funds to reward their vote mobilizer networks? But what is a much larger forms of discretionary spending are spent in sort of significantly different ways. So how do we sort of draw inferences from the spending patterns of these local area development funds to public spending more generally, much of which might be targeted towards low-income neighborhoods or low-income villages? The theme of geography repeatedly emerges in the book. So the distance from the sub-district headquarters, remote villages, large constituencies with far-flung populations. I think even more can be theorized about the role of space in the book along a couple of fronts. So scholars like James Manor, Atul Kohli, have long noted that party organizations are very weak and fleeting in rural areas. They sort of ephemerally pop up during elections. They lean on local, especially caste elites to mobilize co-ethnics, and they sort of disappear. So what is it about these remote agrarian spaces that leads to this thin presence of party networks? Is it just poverty, or is there something about relative demographic stability as compared to the city, employment being mostly closely tied to the land, other sort of forms of local social economic hierarchies? Separately, one concept that doesn't appear in the book, but I think might be relevant for this chapter, is state capacity, not party capacity, but state capacity. A number of studies are demonstrating significant subnational variation in the ability of the state to implement and enforce, leading to what Eric Wibbles and Anirudh Krishna call a gradient of governance that is markedly worse in peripheral and rural spaces. So how does this unevenness in local state capacity inform politician incentives to spend in those areas and shape their assessments about the degree to which they can reward local elites or even claim credit for the things that they do? Okay. I'd also like to hear a little bit more about who these vote mobilizers are. Within the theory of the reciprocity trap, I get the sense that they're locally powerful, they're locally wealthy elites. To me, though, this would be just the tip of the iceberg of a party sangatan or organization in the area. That there is these sort of much larger yet non-elite forms of and groups of karyakarta that often have their own committees at the ward level or the mandal level, the shahar level, city level. They have different positions within the parties. How are we to think of these local vote mobilizers and how they're related to sort of the local foot soldiers who really make up the ground game of parties? Many of these individuals are aspiring, if we can use the subaltern youth, akin to Anirudh Krishna's Naya Netas or Craig Jeffrey's, time pass youth, who turn to politics as a vehicle for socioeconomic upward mobility. Does contact with these sort of more modest party workers, also count? Then finally, I thought a little bit more, and Gautam brought this up too, could be theoretically and empirically said in the book to draw a line between the mobilization of the poor and outcomes in representation. The book uses a language of representational crisis. And certainly, I have no doubt that there is one. But how do we think of this alongside, weak forms of social and political accountability, the marginalization of religious minorities in India, the power of money in politics, and yawning economic inequality? So what kind of representation are we talking about? But anyway, I'll stop there. But please let me underscore again, how much I enjoyed and learned from this book. It's an incredible piece of scholarship. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Excuse me, Ashley.
Our last commentator is not a South Asia scholar, but is a frequent visitor to our seminar. And enlightens us always with his comparative insights. I should add that the generation above me had a very serious Berkeley nucleus. Atul Kohli, Stephen Haggard, Bob Kaufman, Barbara Geddes, all Berkeley. We used to call them Berkeley Mafia. So we have Danny Choi, who took his PhD from Berkeley, commenting on an ex-professor of his. Hopefully, it will not be a mafia-like operation. It can be an intra-Berkeley dialogue, but humor aside, we've always been a great beneficiary of Danny's participation in the seminar. Thank you, Danny.
Okay, that's good. First of all, thank you very much for giving. Yes, I will. First of all, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to engage with these big projects on South Asia. It's a particular privilege for me to talk about Francesca's and Pradeep's book. I think Francesca was maybe 6 or so years ahead of me in grad school, so we overlapped a little bit. I've always been sort of in awe of her work. Same with Pradeep's work. We read many of your papers and books during our classes at Berkeley. So some of my comments are going to be pretty redundant with Adam's comments, but I thought I wanted to sort of give you guys my take on what some of the big sort of contributions are from the comparative perspective. So I really like that we were moving the pendulum back a little bit towards taking the role of class into the study of political parties and elections in the global South. All the foundational literature on political parties in Europe is all about class. None of the very little of the literature on the global South has been about class. So it's really important that we're moving sort of correcting for that oversight. It really sort of, for me, because I do study party politics, highlighted how organizational features of political parties can result in the underrepresentation of certain groups, in this case, the poor. And what sort of really struck me and was a really sort of important part of this book project was that it draws on such an impressive array of data to provide evidence for each step of the causal argument. I initially started off reading chapter 1 and 8, and I ended up reading, I think, 2, 3, 4, 5, not 6, because there was, and so it really whet my appetite to read more, because it clearly was a sequence of causal processes that you were discussing, right? And I think it's really impressive that you have careful descriptive evidence for facts and patterns that are critical for the overall argument. We tend to take these for granted. And I think you did a fantastic job of laying the groundwork for people like me who are not so familiar with the Indian case to understand what was going on. So let me just jump to my understanding of your argument, which was that we start from organizationally weak parties and these large, sprawling electoral units of 2 million voters, right? The average constituency size in Kenya, I think, is like 50,000. So it's like the magnitude of difference is huge, right? No, 50,000. Yes. And in South Korea, for example, it's 117. So, like we're still talking about orders of magnitudes difference, right? So because of these two sort of factors, the parties have to rely on local elites and intermediaries to mobilize voters. These local elites privilege voters with strong ties to them in their networks, right? As a result, poor voters who are not part of these networks are often excluded and not mobilized, which means that turnout drops, voting is erratic amongst poor voters, and that leads to electoral volatility. But when I was reading through the theory, it gave me a few sort of ideas, and I know you did some during your comments, you sort of preempted some of these questions. But for me, I wanted, and this is surprising because I usually err against functionalism, I did want to dash more functionalism here and I fully recognize that parties should not be considered as omnipotent, like rational actors all the time. But in this case, there's a sequence of failures that arise on the part of parties, actually, that raise questions, right? If intermediaries are failing to deliver a significant voting bloc, why do parties not react or respond by replacing those intermediaries with more competent ones that you could ostensibly draw from? If poor voters are such an important voting bloc, why aren't there parties or politicians that capitalize on this opportunity? Why aren't there more pro-poor parties? And you have a bit in the introduction where you talk about the fleeting nature of populist parties, but there are counterexamples in the global south where these pro-poor parties have been doing pretty well, right? I won't say it's at all problematic in any way, but I think given that you have such a compact manuscript, I think you could dedicate a little bit more real estate in the manuscript to explicitly address these sort of functionalist critiques. On an additional point, for me, your book is sort of awesome in that it sort of walks through the sequence of the causal chain. For me, one thing that I found I wanted a little bit more information, this ties to what Adam said, is I wanted a model of party intermediary linkages, right? First of all, who are these intermediaries was a big question. Local elites, yes, that's in the abstract makes a lot of sense. But for me, I was like, are these people who are future candidates potentially? Like there's a whole discussion about who these intermediaries might be, both drawing in the Latin American context, but also recently in Adam and Tarek's book that I think might be really useful. And the question that I had for you was, can we characterize party intermediary relations from the perspective of a typical principal agent framework? You seem to suggest not, right? But, pardon me, if we can, right, why are parties failing to screen for better intermediaries who do engage the poor? Why are parties unable to hold accountable or sanction bad intermediaries for their inability to deliver votes to the poor, right? And if that's not the case, why? You talked about their inability to hold these intermediaries accountable, right? But surely the failure to deliver votes of the poor can be sanctioned by the party by severing ties with the particular local elite in question and looking for alternatives in the marketplace of intermediaries, right? So, so that's one thing that I thought was something that I think you could do a little bit more to clarify. The second sort of thought that came to mind was your model of how we get to electoral volatility actually pushes back against some of the existing accounts. Not sure if you remember Lucas Novais, for example, who's a Berkeley PhD. Yeah, he's also a member of the mafia, but his argument is slightly different in that these brokers have very strong ties to poor voters, as Adam said in the Latin American context. What's happening there to induce that kind of electoral volatility is that these brokers are incredibly disloyal to parties, so they defect all the time, right? With the entire poor voter bloc, right? You seem to say, you talk about how disloyal these intermediaries are, but in a way, then the question is like, how much of the heavy lifting is happening as a result of these disloyal brokers being unable to cultivate a following from poor voters versus is this just a function of brokers being extremely disloyal? So I think that was a sort of a big difference in terms of your work and the work that's out there. Second, I think I wanted a model, a more developed model of poor voting behavior, the voting behavior of the poor, in the absence of party outreach and engagement, right? So we know that poor voters want pro-poor programmatic benefits, right? That's the idea. They want access to public goods, access to the state, right? No party really in your story delivers credibly these benefits, right? So some of them may not end up not voting, right? But for those who do vote, then what do they base their vote on, right? Is it that they randomly support whoever? That surely doesn't sound right. Do they then tend towards cash handouts, whoever is giving them handouts? Or do they resort back to identity voting because there's no mobilization based on these programmatic benefits, right? I think having that kind of tying that loose end will help. For me, I'd be skeptical of like the idea that you would resort back to identity-based voting, because that argument would predict stability rather than volatility, right? So I think having sort of an account for the residual part of like, if being left in a place where there is no mobilization of the poor and they feel, disenchanted or left behind by these parties, then what do they base their vote on? One scope condition, and I think you already mentioned this, a big part of the story is that India's parliamentary constituencies are becoming too large for parties and parliamentary candidates to form direct connection with voters. This is why you need intermediaries, right? This implies actually that for elections where the distance between parties and candidates and voters is smaller, right? Should we see more stable voting patterns, right? Because there, for these locally disaggregated units, it's not such a long distance between the parliamentary candidate and the voter, right? So it perhaps is a scope condition of your argument, or it might be an implication of your argument as well, right? If your theory is right, you could test it out on where the distance between the politician and the voter is not so far in sort of smaller electoral units. Moving to chapter 8, I thought the analysis was very crisp and compelling. Just very, very minor comments. You put vote share of the MP as a control alongside marginalization measures, which are the main explanatory factors, right? I think given Adam's suggestion that you engage with the distributive politics literature, I think a linear vote share term can be misleading. Right. And I think you could be a little bit more agnostic about the functional form of the linear vote share term. Right. You can be quadratic terms, like see what the term looks like. And then, using or trying to use vote margin as an alternative, like that gives you the opportunity to engage with the swing versus core discussion a lot more. For me, though, I think, I was really curious to see whether the effect of marginalization is conditional on prior levels of support for the MP in the previous election, right? So the pro-non-poor bias might have a conditional relationship rather than an unconditional relationship, right? And so those are some of the things. In terms of general exposition of this chapter, I wanted clear interpretation of the coefficient estimate sizes rather than just the significance. I think it would be very helpful to get a sense of the magnitude and the significance of these effects, right? And to get a sense of how biased the distribution is. That's not discrimination, but a distribution. And a final thought on two more additional thoughts. One on the financial institutions then. That would have certainly not been my sort of prior going in. I thought it was a pretty smart way to think about this problem. And I think that kind of creativity made a lot of sense. So I would be in favor of keeping that analysis in, because there's really no real good way to test what you were saying. It's really difficult. So, having that additional analysis was really interesting. But the sort of residual thought I had, I saw huge effects for the impact of the MP LADS allocation, right? So that the poor really reward politicians for allocating stuff, right? And so it is still surprising to me why politicians remain sort of ambivalent or unaware of these massive sort of benefits, right? And maybe that's my misreading because the impact might not be as large, but it did occur to me, if there are these strong benefits, why haven't MPs capitalized on it, given that the poor often constitute such a large part of the voting base, right? But thanks so much. It was such an incredible read. I really enjoyed it.
So we can also hear now. And we can take some more questions from the audience or say some more ourselves. Did you?
I have more to say.
Yes.
Yeah. So come now. You can come here.
Or we can sit anywhere. There are only so few of us.
Okay. Fine.
I will take notes.
So you have more to say. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I wanted to pick up on a thread that I think has cut across most of the comments, which is sort of, and Danny put a point on this, right, about sort of...
Let's give her the microphone.
I'll just talk about it. It's okay.
No, I know you.
Thank you, Nair.
You can do so, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. So this point about sort of, are parties actually aware? Do they not know? Why are they not doing more? Here are all these votes that you could have. This is, maybe low-hanging fruit. And you make a really compelling argument related to scale and inaccessibility and the cost of running, and candidates have to self-finance and all these kind of, right? So that's very, very compelling. But I think that there's both historical and sub-national variation that you could exploit a lot more to, in fact, strengthen your theory, right? So you talk about Kerala, you talk about Tamil Nadu, you talk about West Bengal, but you talk about them as if they're outliers. And maybe they are, but they're massive outliers. Right?
Yes.
They're huge states who are serving and mobilizing the poor in large numbers in very, very different ways. And so I think to kind of center that more, so just to give you one example, you write, it's like 2 sentences, right? But Kerala and West Bengal have panchayat elections that are run on party platforms,
yes.
right? And that builds in and institutionalizes a kind of organizational apparatus.
Yes.
Parties, therefore, are not weakly organized at the local level as they are in other places, right? So that actually strengthens your argument. You can say here, Kerala and West Bengal have these really different histories of mobilizing the poor within electoral politics, and it's because the parties are organizationally stronger at the local level. That's consistent with your argument. So I think by actually foregrounding, not treating them as kind of outliers, but actually pulling that more centrally into the analysis, it could actually strengthen your argument. But it also provokes this question of why don't other states do that? Right? If they can look around and say, if we did that, we would actually build this local organizational capacity, right? So I think that's one sort of mystery. The other mystery that I think is lurking in the back of the book is sort of, why is there such a lack of poor people's movements, right? And again, if you look sub-nationally, if you look at Kerala, if you look at West Bengal, if you look to a certain extent in Tamil Nadu, you have very different histories of kind of mass organization along the cross-cutting cleavage of class. So think, Patrick Keller's work, he's not here today, but right, Patrick's work on kind of how very intentional mobilization along class lines by parties in Kerala, sort of creating class as a cross-cutting cleavage that foreclosed the opportunity to therefore build up parties around caste or other kinds of identity-based cleavages, right? So I think, again, sort of exploiting some of that subnational variation some more could, I think, really strengthen your argument.
And to take it forward, this line of reasoning, I don't know how easy it is to do this, but, and I think Danny hinted at that certainly at the Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal electoral arenas, because the poor are mobilized, presumably you should expect greater stability and lesser volatility, right? At the state level and at the local level, right? Is that true? I don't know. I mean, it should be. It doesn't seem like it was true of Kerala. It just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Tamil Nadu used to go back and forth with Anna DMK and DMK. West Bengal was very stable, let's say, under CPM. And local elections got introduced there a little earlier than 1993. I think Red Panchayats, Abdul Kohli studied them. So if the poor are mobilized as they are in these three states, then you should expect lesser volatility, right? That would be one implication. The other would be at the assembly level, since the local constituencies are small and assembly level constituencies are smaller than the parliamentary constituencies, at the assembly elections and local elections should also show you lesser volatility. Yeah. Right? That I don't know how easy it is to show that and whether the data can be easily put together, but that would be another implication of this. And as Adam and Danny was speaking, talking about who are these intermediaries, and I was quickly reminded of the Clientelism and Brokers book by Stokes et al., where on Latin America they say intermediaries keep changing their parties all the time. There are no loyal intermediaries. I think that's a rather interesting statement she made. I thought there would be some real Peronistas there. They would never change, and they would always be the Peronistas, and etc. But that's not what the book says, if I recall correctly. So, who are these intermediaries, and what do they are they themselves disloyal, and therefore, what is and the way what would be the implication for stability? You're saying, right? Implication for stability and volatility, etc. Anyway, so other questions? Anyone? Any other comments from anyone before we have Pradeep respond now? Pradeep, go ahead. Yeah, 20 minutes.
No, it's just too long. I hear Gilles. Thanks.
Gilles again. Can we give him?
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah. No, I mean, it might also be useful to, remember that candidates, are not even expected to mobilize everyone, right? Because we know that, in India, candidates themselves know that very well that party organization provides certain amount of mobilization. Candidates, basically have to mobilize whoever they can mobilize. So it's not surprising that they will turn to local elite networks in order to achieve that. But I think it's useful to remember that there's no expectations that the candidate should necessarily connect with everyone or mobilize everyone. It's always sort of small circle mobilization in the first place.
But then the question that Danny is asking returns, right? Why can't you mobilize intermediaries who will also mobilize the poor, so that you have a better chance of winning, because the poor are such a large proportion of the voting bloc? Why can't you mobilize better intermediaries? Yeah.
Yeah, Gautam. And Gabby.
Well, I have a quick two-finger on that, right?
Yeah.
So one question that I have is how, and this goes back a little bit to my comment earlier about who counts as poor, but also who identifies as poor and how identifiable are the poor, right? So we're sort of treating the poor as if it's this very concrete, discrete, observable category. Is it actually so clear to candidates, to parties, but even to the poor themselves? Does one identify and kind of think in those terms, right? Because there are these sort of discrete categories that we're working through as we theorize this. But if no one can actually identify or don't identify themselves, or if they're not identifiable, then it becomes a lot harder for parties. Yeah.
Actually, my question was for Adam, which was, what do we know about these intermediate, what does empirical literature tell us in India about whether they are loyal or disloyal, or can that be used as some sort of mechanism of addressing this issue?
In the machine politics book, I think you have some account of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is a study of Jaipur and Bhopal. So the extent to which that travels across India is always in question. But part of the study was a survey of about 630 brokers, these netas within the slum settlements. About a quarter of them switch back and forth between the BJP and the Congress. Ones that start with the BJP are more likely to stay with the BJP because a lot of them came up through the RSS. Many of them have aspirations to get a ticket to fight as a municipal ward councillor, but they don't have the wealth themselves to ever dream of like launching a campaign to become an MLA and certainly not an MP. Happy to say more about them, but I think it's interesting. Our voter surveys, also across small towns in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, about a third of voters say that they switch back and forth between parties from election to election. So that really resonated with me. How much?
But it's not the poor who are going back and forth. You're saying 1/3 of the total voters.
Yeah.
That you survey, and you had
but
random
also
sample.
the poor. Our earlier work in slum settlements. A third were going back and forth, but a very similar number of just a representative sample of people
from a
across these
representative
towns
sample
are also
Going back.
yeah.
No, but your study is that the
Can we give it?
volatility, most of it is at the poor.
Can you speak in?
Your conclusion is more on the volatility is more because of the poor, not
That is correct. That is the argument.
Okay, that is okay.
Yeah.
We should clarify.
So I just more of curiosity. Now that I've heard so much about WhatsApp being used in India, right? In fact, hardly anybody uses WhatsApp. People in India only use WhatsApp. So a lot of that outreach is happening in WhatsApp from the political. So is there ways to get that data in terms of engagement with that voter, or is it all opaque?
I have two reactions, and I will give you neither of you have one reaction which you may not like. I'll be honest, I think this is the fascination of the intellectual classes living in Delhi, because in our surveys, most of the poor do not have a smartphone. Number one. Number two, even there, the proportion of the phone is limited to a family member. Right? So the idea that, this is a widespread phenomenon is certainly not, I don't think that is correct. I think it is certainly used. WhatsApp University is a real thing, and I think messages are being spread through it. Second, you shouldn't have students who know too much, and I have a student who's actually done a lot of field work, and she says, many of these people are actually, they get that their phones are full. They don't have enough memory. People are not accessing it. They're not looking at these messages. So you may be sending them out. And then she finally said, because somebody was talking about give women cell phones, everybody's, sorry, I hope I don't offend anybody. Everybody's into this, give women information and we will become more. She says, at least when she's observed in rural Jharkhand, is that A, they don't have the phones. B, if they have the phones, they can't access the data because the phone is full and they're not necessarily looking at it and we don't know that. And third, even if you have the data, local power structures are saying, wait a minute. Right? So there's a combination of things going on for which we don't have an answer. So we have lots of speculation and things could go either way, but that's my take on it.
The last time I looked at the WhatsApp data, I think it was maybe 2 years ago. The totals, it was, of course, the largest WhatsApp market in the world. That is true. But it was something like 450 million or so out of 1.4 billion, right? And WhatsApp cannot work on an old cell phone. It has to be a smartphone, right? Am I right or not? WhatsApp cannot work on, right? So if you look at how many people have smartphones in India, that is probably not more than 400 million either. Right, that number. That cell phones are now about 1 billion or so, or a little over 1 billion, may well be right. Right, but smartphones are probably only, we can check, the data comes out every year. So 2024 December data must be out by now, so we can check that. But before giving my lecture on this, in my India class, I go back to it to see what is the latest available. And of course, it's rising very fast. But last time I saw it was 400 million only.
Okay. Can I ask some questions before we head out? Because I have some very specific questions I would like to ask and the answers. First is, we are stuck. And we're stuck in one serious concern for us. Francesca and I have gone back and forth on this, which is the whole issue of class and poverty. Now, the census data which we use for getting our volatility measures only gives us literacy. And we use literacy as a proxy for poverty. Therefore, we have to use literacy as an index when we construct these poverty variables. And it's an index we're making out of various things, right? So, and we can, and I completely agree with Gabby that we should need to contextualize this and make it a little bit richer. That's correct. But the thing is, given these data constraints, and let's be pragmatic, what would you do? That's the first question. Yeah.
One thought is the SECC data
Yes.
has been aggregated to the village level and is available through Sam Asher
Shrug.
or through the Shrug thing. So you could actually just look at the correlation between the SECC data and the literacy data.
Okay, we could look.
Validate the literacy data, and then all your analysis you could basically be taken.
Okay, I think that's a good idea.
When we say India, 18% people are below the poverty line, that data obviously is not from the census. It comes from where? Consumption surveys, right? But that is not disaggregated down to the village level. So that's why it's unusable for them.
No, the SECC data
is disaggregated down to?
It's actually the individual level.
It's individual level data.
Yeah. So you could actually do even more sophisticated analysis because you can look at Dalits versus non-Dalits.
Yes.
The cost level data would be difficult.
Right.
Because you have to figure out how to. That's a full level.
We don't want to show that. So then, that's one question I have. The second question I have, I have many, many questions which I need answers to, which I need helping with, but we'll get to that one. The title is something I think we have some dispute about, and I think that's something, Francesca and I need to have a conversation as to what we should use, and some of it is, right or wrong. And
here is one solution. Shallow democratic representation as opposed to shallow democracy.
Could be.
Shallow democratic representation.
Yeah, could be. The other thing which I think I have lots of, as I go through my notes now, which is I have so many questions. I think this is not going to end. So let me see if we have anything else to say. First, I want to say thank you so much. I just texted Francesca if she has anything to say, and she said no. But she said, and the good news is, and the great news is, she said there are questions I don't know how to answer, which means we have work to do. Right, and I'm so glad that we have work to do because we like to think a little bit harder, and there are things we'll be able to do and things we will not be able to do. We'll be able to come up with a richer description of what mobilizes, I don't know. And I completely agree with you and all of you that we should have a much more clearly specified model. And I think all of your comments, and I can go through them individually, were breathtakingly good. So I think so. Thank you so much, everybody. And we need to work, and we will be forever grateful to you for actually giving us the time and effort and spending some engaging with this material. So thank you, Ash, for hosting us, and thank you everybody for giving us these suggestions.
Anything about SES?
About
the SES argument, social economic status.
What is the argument you made?
The poor. I mean, they're Verba and Brady and I have always said that even in the West, the poor don't participate.
Our argument is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Our argument is that is a standard view, which is an individual resource-based argument.
Yes.
And what we find, at least in chapter 6, clearly, is that if parties engage the poor, the gap shrinks.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. So in other words, the argument is not about SES only, because then that would be a boring argument. This actually parties are doing work that is actually actively demobilizing the poor.
So they close the SES gap.
They close the SES gap, yes. And that's a big deal. And I think that's something we should not ignore. And also, quite frankly, on the ground, you know this well, which is everybody knows where the power structures are. And there's no reason to believe that if a poor person doesn't want access to the things that they can get access to, and who controls them, right? So if you give them a chance to engage with parties, they will do it, right? Elections in India are much more meaningful than elections in India matter for people's lives much more than elections in the US. I mean, now we're realizing it matters for people's lives, but most people, listen, I'll give you an example. And this may sound far-fetched. I was in Spain. Catalonia had its independence referendum. The day before the referendum, everybody was in the cafes, eating, drinking food. Cafes were working. The day after the referendum, everything was happening. Can you imagine a referendum in India on independence happening, and the day before, everybody is going around Spanish to this, standing in the lines of the Spanish state and trying to get welfare services? Do you think that would ever happen? And this may sound weird. I think in some ways, the West has done something really well, which is why all these arguments will work, is that the bureaucratic state delivers so efficiently that you can actually have parties, the space in which parties operate is shrunk. In the Indian case, that's not the case. Parties are still relevant in people's lives. Political connections still matter. And that's why I think we can't apply the same arguments across both cases, because the role of the state and the role of parties is very, very different. So that's just a thought for later.
The classical argument, Nehruvian argument used to be, we need party mobilization because the bureaucratic state will be impervious to the poor.
Yes.
The poor can be brought in only through politics and parties.
Yes.
Bureaucrats are not going to deliver otherwise. So it's through parties you exercise the pressure on district magistrate and block development officer, etc., etc. Even if you created the block development officer, he will not deliver unless representatives of SCs, STs, and SCs and STs and the poor would be mobilized by the party. So go out and mobilize, right? And exercise pressure. The same argument about land reforms again and again. Land reforms will not happen unless there is not only, there's pressure from above coming, legislation has been passed, but there has to be pressure from below also. So the parties that would mobilize the poor for land reforms would be the Congress party would not mobilize. The Congress party was so reliant on landlords. It's the Communist Party that mobilized. And where it mobilized well, land reforms happened, Kerala and West Bengal. Right? And otherwise, the Congress Party. So there is this great line in the earlier work is that Nehru is asking his party to mobilize the poor while being dependent on local elites. And this argues, where is it? I think Myron Mead and others have argued this contradiction could not be solved. Ultimately, oh yes, I remember the line. Imperatives of party building defeated the progressive economic platform. Without the landlords and the local elites, you could not take the Congress party further into the countryside after independence. And you are asking this party to apply pressure for land reforms. How will that happen? That is the imperatives of party building defeated the economic program of Nair on land reforms, not on everything, right? So anyway, so the idea was that somehow political mobilization will make the state more responsive to the poor.
And the counterfactual is hard.
Yeah, what?
Counterfactual is very hard. And I don't know. That's later. It's almost 5 o'clock. So
yes, 5 o'clock. Time to thank Pradeep for giving us so much to think about and reflect on. Thank you, Gabby, Adam, Gautam, and Danny for your commentary, very careful commentary. We close the session now, and thank you all for coming. This was, of course, conceptualized the book, mini book workshop, so do not wait, public event. Next is a more public event. And the third one is Savarkar. I think this room will be absolutely full. Your colleague is coming to speak on Savarkar.
She's not right.
Yeah.
Good book.
It's a terrific book, yes. I mean, 90% of Savarkar's writings are in Marathi, 10% in English. We've all read the 10%. Her first language is Marathi. She has read the 90% that people have missed, including Vikram Sampath. Right? 90% is Marathi, which is read, including the plays and the poetry. And on that basis, the book has been written, which Princeton has just published. And it's Rohit Day, Sridhar Kaviraj and I will be commenting on that book on 21st. And next week is Yamini is here. Yamini's book on Delhi's education, the AAP model. Did it work? Did it not work? Why? Etc. We will be discussing that. So thank you all for coming. There is a reception outside.